Hello and welcome to Leading Interviews. This is episode 10. Today I'm speaking with Professor Michelle Ryan, the inaugural director of the Global Institute of Women's Leadership, GIWL, at the ANU, the Australian National University. ANU is the first sister institute of GIWL, based at King's College in London, founded and chaired by former Australian Prime Minister Julia Gillard. The Institute aims to create a world where being a woman is not a barrier to becoming a leader in any field. So welcome, Michelle, and I'm so pleased to be able to speak with you today.
Thanks so much for having me, Carol.
Pleasure. Michelle, we'll get straight into it. You coined the term glass cliff. Well, firstly, congratulations on that. A term that has since entered the public discourse. The New York Times named the glass cliff as one of the top 100 ideas that shaped 2008, and it was actually Oxford Dictionary's word of the year in 2016. Can you tell us a little bit about how the phrase, you thought about the phrase and how it is now being used?
Yeah, the idea of the glass cliff really came from a body of research that we were doing here at the University of Exeter, trying to look at what happened once women broke through the glass ceiling. So when they did take on leadership positions, what type of leadership positions they took on. And our research showed that women were much more likely to take on these leadership positions in times of crisis, when things were difficult, when things were going bad, if it was a corporation, when share prices were going down. And so these leadership positions were relatively risky and precarious. So the metaphor of the glass cliff really extends on the metaphor of the glass ceiling, which I think most people are familiar with, this idea of a barrier that women can't move through. But when they do take on leadership positions, this risk and precarity means that while they're up very high in these leadership positions, the chance of falling is high as well. So this idea of kind of teetering on the edge. So over the last 15 to 20 years now, we've been looking at this concept, trying to understand it, and I guess seeing it as a relatively new and relatively subtle form of discrimination that women might face in the leadership sphere.
Yeah, but that's so fascinating. Why do you think women are attracted to take on these terrifyingly precarious roles?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I guess it's a question about, is it that women are attracted to these positions, or is it that these are the positions that they're not given? It's not that women are passive in this process, but why is this where they end up? And our research again shows that it's not that women are more attracted to crisis positions than are men. So we've got evidence that shows that. But I think it's more that there's two things going on. One, other people think that women will be particularly good at these crisis positions. And the second one is that women may not have other options. So men might be able to say, well, there's a crisis position here, there's a different position here, I'll pick and choose the ones that are best for me. Whereas women, because we know there's barriers to their leadership, might feel that it's the only leadership opportunity they have.
But aren't they worried about the reputational risk that attaches to those sorts of roles?
Yeah, and I think that's part of the crisis and part of the precarity is how one's evaluated when one takes on a leadership position. The research actually really started with a newspaper article in the New York Times, in the Times of London, which looked at women in these top leadership roles. And they made the conclusion that women were causing these companies to perform badly, rather than what we found, which was the complete opposite, that when organisations perform badly, they appointed women, but that relationship between poor performance and women becomes a bit muddied, and then people blame women for that. So there's absolutely a reputational sort of damage, both for women as a whole, so this idea women aren't good at leadership, and for the individual women that take it on. But again, I guess part of this issue is that if you don't have any other options at leadership positions, maybe women come in and say, well, I'll do my best. Maybe I can turn it around, or maybe it will be worth it.
Although, I mean, and I don't know what your research tells you, but anecdotally, when you look at women who have suffered that sort of reputational risk, they're very rarely given a second chance, whereas we all know that when men seem to suffer the same sort of fate, they seem to be able to lift themselves up, dust themselves off, and say, well, what's the next challenge? Does your research show anything about that?
Yeah, there's actually some really interesting research in psychology, which is about how we attribute success and how we attribute failure. And what's really interesting is that when women succeed, we often say things like, oh, well, she was lucky, or she had good support, or she was just in the right place at the right time. When men get lucky, when men succeed, it's very much about, oh, he's a brilliant leader. Isn't he fantastic? He totally turned that around. And the opposite is the case when things go badly. So when things go badly, the woman is attributed to it must be about her. She wasn't good enough. She couldn't negotiate. She didn't have the skills. Whereas when men, it goes badly for men. And this is not all the case, but the research shows that men are more likely to say, well, he was really unlucky in that situation. He didn't have the support he needed. The stock market was doing something else. So those attributions are also gendered.
Oh, fascinating. And are those attributions, I mean, does that still exist, or is that changing?
Yeah, well, that's really interesting because we like to think that things are changing. You know, society feels like it's changing very rapidly. But a lot of things around gender stereotypes, how we think about gender, how we respond to gender, these things are very slow to change. So even though evidence for this attribution was found sort of in the 80s, it's still happening today.
Right. Well, just as a matter of interest, do you have anyone particular in mind that's in the public eye that sort of exemplifies this notion of the glass cliff?
Recently, if you look at the political sphere, I think Theresa May is a classic example, or a very good example of the glass cliff. So she was someone who I think has always had leadership ambitions, but it's very interesting that she got her chance sort of around Brexit. So the Brexit referendum came through, and we see Cameron leaving. We had Johnson actually sort of moving in the other direction. So I think it's very interesting that she came to lead the UK and the Conservative Party at this massive time of crisis. And I think it was very difficult for her. I think it would have been difficult for anyone to really succeed and shine in that role. And I think what we were talking about before, about how attributions are made, how it's thought about, I mean, she was criticised very, very strongly. And I think the view was that she didn't do a good job there. But I think what's also interesting is when we look at the differences in how, say, Boris Johnson's performance is evaluated versus Theresa May's, there's very different attributions there. We're told that she was a bad negotiator, but she actually negotiated a deal, whereas Boris Johnson was unable to negotiate a very strong deal, but yet was seen as a strong leader. So I think in the political field, Theresa May really exemplifies that. I think if you want to look in the corporate field, there's many examples as well. I think one that is a good example is Mary Barra, who became the CEO of General Motors, an automotive company in the US. She was appointed first woman to ever run an automotive company, and she came in 2 weeks before a massive recall of millions of cars, of which she knew nothing about beforehand. So I think although she's done incredibly well, she's won awards for her crisis management and her leadership, I think there was very real precarity there for her as well.
And is she still at the head of that company?
She absolutely is. So she's someone that sort of triumphed despite being put in that really risky, precarious position.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting, isn't it? So why do you think that she was able to survive that?
Yeah, I mean, probably a lot of it comes down to personal determination. Our research also shows that there's a number of things that can help as well. So I think having the support of a board or senior management or other senior figures within the organisation is really important, as is having the resources to deal with the crisis. So being given enough time to deal with things, enough money, enough, all of the things that one needs. So I think a Glasscliff position isn't always going to lead to failure. I think there's an increased risk of failure, but if there is enough support, people can turn it around.
Yeah. And would you have described Julia Gillard's situation when she took over as Prime Minister as being on the precipice of the glass cliff?
Yeah, I think there's certainly been analyses around that, around whether Julia Gillard's position was there. I mean, I think it was certainly a risky and precarious time in terms of, I guess, the political coalitions that needed to be put together, the more progressive coalition to form government. And I think I guess, the issues that the Labor Party was even going through in terms of, I guess, the leadership spill and internal issues within the Labor Party. I mean, I think while there might be some precarity there, I think what's most, I guess, dominant about Julia Gillard's prime ministership is, I think, the absolute sexism that she faced in that role. So I think that probably overshadows whatever issues were going on when she came into the role. I think just the sexism and misogyny that she faced.
Yeah, so fascinating, isn't it? Because, of course, she had men before her and men after her who, of course, unseated their leaders without the same sort of consequences as she suffered, which goes to your point about sexism.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, those attributions that were made. So the media spoke very much about her stabbing someone in the back. And that rhetoric's never happened before. It's always been a very fair leadership jostle, whereas she didn't know her place, and I think there was a real pushback against that.
Yeah, of course. And always those alluding to Lady Macbeth, which always helps.
Absolutely.
Michelle, you've spent the last 17 years working at the University of Exeter and are shortly returning to Australia in your exciting new position with GIWL, which we're all very, very excited about. Can you share with us some of the work of GIWL and what your priorities are for the organisation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've set GIWL up as the sister institute, as you've said, to the King's College Institute. We have a focus in the Asia Pacific region. So even though we're still a global institute, we really want to focus on the Asia Pacific region. I think we want to do three things to bring those with our, I guess, key aims. So the first is to really do cutting edge research. I think if we're going to address issues of gender equality, we really have to understand what is happening and have a good idea of what is not just describing the inequalities that are there, but understanding the inequalities. What is happening there? I'm a social and organizational psychologist, so I really want to understand what is happening to cause these inequalities that we can see. And then once we have that really clear evidence base, I think it's important that we work with organizations and policymakers to implement interventions that can actually affect change, so that we do this in an evidence-based way, so that we understand what's happening, but we also understand what works. Sometimes we can understand what's going on, but the intervention to change it is unclear. So, for example, we know that unconscious bias exists, for example, our stereotypes of men and women, but unconscious bias training is not particularly effective to change that. So I think that's the difference between understanding the processes, but also understanding what's effective. And then I guess the third arm of GIWL is one of advocacy. So really advocating where change should be happening, what we should be prioritising, and what the really salient issues of the time are. So I think that's our sort of remit of what we want to do. For me personally, I think there's a number of priorities and how I want to approach that. I think it's really important that we try and fix organizational and social culture instead of trying to fix women. I think there's a lot of interventions that happen where we try and address very real issues by focusing on women. So we give women confidence training and leadership training. We teach them how to negotiate properly and all of these things. And I think these are all very good initiatives. Everyone can deal, it's good to have some leadership training and some negotiation training. But for me, that focuses on women as the problem, as if inequality happens because women are not confident enough. For me, I want to step back and say, what is it about social and organisational culture that reduces women's confidence? And we know that actually confident women are punished all the time. There's a massive backlash against confident women. So just making women more confident but doing nothing to change a culture that has a backlash against confident women is really problematic. I think I'm really interested in defining leadership very broadly. I don't just want to look at corporate leadership or political leadership or those women right at the top. I think it's really important to look at the pipeline of leadership and seeing leadership in terms of community leadership, in terms of sort of middle managers, in terms of head librarians, all sorts of different ways we can think about leadership and where women can have influence and power. And I think it's also just really important to look at all of these things in an intersectional way. So we're not just looking at, say, white middle-class women, that we do look at how gender might intersect with race or class or disability or all of these other factors that we know are bases of discrimination.
It's so fascinating, isn't it? I mean, what is it about our organisational and social cultures that actually allows that sort of discrimination to operate? And is it so entrenched that it's going to take decades to shift?
Yeah, I mean, I think the decades timeline is absolutely right. I mean, I came up through university doing women's studies and sociology, and, I was quite sort of political in the 90s, in the early 90s. And if you had asked me then, when would we get change, what would be happening, I would have thought that by now, 30 years later, that we would be closer to our goal. And in some ways, some things have changed, but actually the pace of change in terms of gender equality is very slow. Glacially so, and actually it's not always going up. I think sometimes we regress back and things go backwards. So I think because gender is entrenched in everything that we do, it isn't just in organisations and in HR, it is about how we raise our children, it's about how we set up our friendships, it's about how the domestic division of labour works, but how we see and define everything. So to change our stereotypes and our views and to change our social structures really about what power looks like, what leadership looks like, what good parenting looks like. These are things that you can't legislate against necessarily. And I think those are the things that take the most time to change. So our stereotypes of what men and women are like essentially have not changed very much in 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? I remember being on a panel in my early 30s with talking about, where are the women? And there was a woman in her 60s who was on the panel with me and who was, telling me basically to calm down because change takes a very long time. And I was just beside myself. And now I find myself in my 60s telling other women, in their 30s, change takes a very long time. It is extremely frustrating. Extremely.
Yes, absolutely.
Do you think that something like the Me Too movement, though, is like a catalyst for sort of leaping over some of the barriers and to change and sort of takes us to a whole new level?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think where we do get change is that we get these big spikes of change. Mostly we've seen those around legislation, so around the Sex Discrimination Act, or say if we look back even further around women's voting rights. So we get the most change when we legislate. But as I was saying, there's many things that you can't actually legislate against. But I do think the Me Too movement is a big catalyst. I think it brought issues of gender equality and violence and harassment to the fore, and I think it sparked a very strong discussion. I think that happened in Australia. Here in the UK, we had similar ones around Sarah Everard and the death of Sarah, the murder of Sarah Everard, that happened at a similar time as well. I think what's interesting there, though, is whether that big catalyst for political action and social discourse actually leads to change. So I think I'm really glad these things are talked about, but whether that actually leads to real change or whether it's a bit of a burst and then we go back to rest on our laurels, I think that's what we really need to grab that and move with that.
Yeah, and I think that's what a lot of older women have said to me, is that you've got to be vigilant about maintaining the ground that you've made, rather than letting it regress. So, yeah, we have to be vigilant about the changes that we get through. So do you think that legislation is the best lever for cementing change, or what other levers do we have?
Yeah, I think in the past legislation has been, that has proven to be successful. I think, as I was saying, I think the remaining drivers of inequality at the moment are not things you can legislate against. You can't outlaw stereotypes. I mean, that just doesn't work. You can't tell people what to think around what makes a good leader or what makes a good parent. So I think we're now at the point where we really need to be addressing those cultural and organizational stereotypes. But I do think there are things that can be done that can help address those sorts of things. I think, as I was saying, a lot of the work that we've been doing in the gender equality space has been at an organizational, institutional level to try and address inequality from that side. So whether that's in terms of promotions or hiring criteria or quotas or training at that organizational level. Of course, the flip side of that is the other side of the work-life balance thing, is what's happening at home. And I think we're doing a lot less in that space. I think other countries have done more there. If you look at Scandinavia in terms of things around maternity leave or shared parental leave, in terms of affordable childcare, and in terms of, I think, also valuing women's work and paying women's work appropriately. I think those are the things that we need to start to do, because you can't make people think of parenting in a different way, but if you put in place things where men are doing more parenting, where there's expectations that parental leave will be shared and legislated against is important. So in the UK, for example, we have the option of parental leave, but it's optional. So men do not take it up. I think it's a very, very small percentage of men that actually take parental leave. In Scandinavia, they say, here is your leave. Half of it has to be taken by a man, one within a heterosexual relationship, a man, the other half by a woman. And if the man doesn't take it, then you lose that. And of course, there's a much higher uptake then. And then that sees a change in the views of what parenting looks like. So I think those sorts of legislations are there. But I think it is also just a broader discussion socially about what are our norms and what are our stereotypes.
Yeah. Do you think that the pandemic and people being furloughed from work and having to work remotely from home has actually shifted some of the views around, men's and women's roles in the home?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone was hopeful that would be the case. I think a lot of the research shows that women are taking on a massively disproportionate amount of the childcare and the homeschooling. So if anything, I think it's exacerbated the inequality. So I think it could have been a really good opportunity for men to take more of a parenting role. And I think they have taken on more of a parenting role than they did before, but women have taken on massively more as well. So there is a lot there. We're doing actually some work at the moment that's a big cross-cultural study across, I think, 100 different countries about relationship quality and the division of sort of labour within relationships. And it is essentially that the division of labour is becoming more traditional. So women are taking on more childcare, more of the cooking and those sorts of things as well. And that's really had an impact on women's relationship satisfaction as well. So COVID, I think, has not been good for that sort of division of labour.
That's so fascinating. I mean, because anecdotally, and purely anecdotally, over the last few years, I thought that men were taking on much more of the sort of, I mean, not the drudgery stuff, but definitely the cooking and definitely some part of childcare. I mean, even, just when I take my grandchildren to school, I notice so many more men bringing their children to school than when my kids were little and went to school.
Yeah, and I think there are certain groups where that is happening. I think that tends to be a very white middle class phenomenon where men are stepping up and taking on some more childcare. But I think what's also really interesting is that, and this is a fascinating figure, is that women nowadays, so working women that work full time, spend more time with their children in a face-to-face sort of parenting way than women in their 50s, in the 50s. Wow. So, in the 50s, mothers, even though they were stay-at-home mothers, would be perhaps doing a lot of laundry, a lot of cooking. There weren't as many shortcuts. There was a lot of things. But there was also the idea that children would play quietly in another room. So these days, though, the idea is that women have to be much more active in their parenting. So they have to be taking their kids to soccer and sitting there and cheering them on. They have to be playing with them. They have to be interacting with them in these sorts of ways. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I mean, we can talk about how, what good parenting looks like, but it is not the case that women these days spend less time doing those things. They actually spend more because all parents spend more of this active time with parents now. So yes, men might be stepping up a little bit, but it also has raised the bar for what women have to do.
Yeah, I remember the swimming after school, the ballet after school, the footy practice after school. It's relentless, absolutely relentless.
Yeah. I find it really interesting because when I was a child in the 70s and 80s, my parents would absolutely just drop us off at all of those things. They would never stay. And it feels like, so one parent would drop us off, another parent would come and pick us up. Maybe this was just my parents, but these days there's a very clear expectation that one stays, one cheers on through, not even a soccer game, soccer practice. So I think there are really strong expectations now of a particular type of involvement that is incredibly time consuming. Now, that could be very positive, but it's not reducing women's load.
Yeah. And it's so interesting, isn't it? Because so many more women are working. So
yes.
Maybe it's meant to be that sort of counterbalance of the guilt of, well, I'm working, so I need to stand and cheer at the soccer practice.
Yeah, and I've got a colleague in the Netherlands who's doing exactly work on this about parental guilt, and that it really does make women spend more time, spend more money, do more things, cook a bigger dinner and all of those sorts of things, because to try and make up for the guilt of maybe not being there, when kids get home from school, for example.
I'm just having a thought about how you deal with that, with all the responsibility that you have. Is there any moves towards a more communal sort of living where you have, because I actually think even of my children, and my youngest daughter lives in a shared house with her boyfriend and 5 others. But I know that she sort of feels, and she's only in her 20s, as she gets older, she can't see herself not living in a shared house where responsibilities for not only the housework are shared, but also for childcare. Yes. So are there any sort of generalised moves towards that?
Yeah, I mean, not that I know of, not that I'm aware of, but, they've always, the saying that it takes a village to raise a child. And I think, we're increasingly atomized, it really is around individual households rather than sort of larger communities. So I think I'm not aware of movements like that, but I think it really is interesting about what that looks like. I think the other issue is around, I guess, other countries and other communities have much more of, different generations living within one household. So you have that expectation of sharing, so there will be a grandmother or a grandfather at home. There will be those multiple sorts of generations that can provide support, which I guess in Australia we don't necessarily have.
Although I was just speaking to a colleague who was telling me that she actually actively looks after her grandchild on a Tuesday and a Thursday, 2 days a week. And she's a working woman.
Yes.
Who's around 60, but she's just decided that she will take these 2 days to help her kids out and look after children. And I think that's happening more and more, where grandparents are taking that very active role in caring for grandchildren.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely the case. I think, and part of that, I think, is about the affordability of childcare, about more women working full time. I actually think it's also about the affordability of housing and things like that, about, that families really need two incomes in order to even get on the property ladder. So taking extended maternity leaves or parental leave is actually increasingly becoming, not economically viable. Yeah. So I think absolutely grandparents are taking more of a role.
Yeah. Michelle, I recently chaired a panel of amazing female politicians that at GIWL's workshop focused on Parliament as a gendered workplace. This is really such a critical issue for us to tackle in Australia, and it's so great to see GIWL taking such a leadership role in developing a new code of conduct. Can you share with us your thoughts on this and the sort of impact it could have?
Yeah, I think the Code of Conduct is a really important initiative, because I think this really is about saying, how do you change norms around what sort of behaviour is acceptable? So actually writing them down and saying, these are our norms, this is how we behave. And if you're going to work here, this is how you have to behave as well. So it sets the expectations there very, very clearly and in writing. I think what the workshop really showed, and I think what I believe, is that it's really important that there's clarity around that it's a short and clear code of conduct, that it's not pages and pages of behaviours and things like that people won't actually read. It has to be clear and short and sharp. I think it has to be something that everyone in Parliament House, signs up to. So this is not just for ministers or for senior people, but this is for everyone that works there. So whether that's contractors, whether that's service staff and support staff, and, that it has to work all the way through, whether it's staffers as well. I think it's not enough just to have it there. I think there has to be mandatory training as well. So there has to be training around what that looks like as well. And I think there has to be sanctions and consequences. So if people break that code of conduct, there has to be very real consequences. And I think what goes with that is that when you sign a contract to work there, you also sign a contract to say, I will abide by this code of conduct. So that there's very clear routes to dismissal if that code of conduct is broken as well. And I do think it's also important how this is implemented and how it's overseen. So I think there has to be an independent body to do that. I think this is the same with all organisations. I think internal HR processes are not always set up to, protect employees. They're sometimes set up to protect or look after the organisation. So I think having an independent body there is important. But yeah, so I think we've got our code of conduct and we've got our sort of recommendations around what that will look like. And I think just last week was submitted to the Jenkins inquiry as well. So I think I'm very excited to see that happen. But I think it's a model for all organisations, right? This is not just Parliament that needs this. A lot of the discourse and discussion has been about the incidents that have happened in Parliament House, but these sorts of incidents are happening in all sorts of organisations at all sorts of different levels as well. So I think it's a model about how we say what is appropriate behaviour and what is inappropriate behaviour.
Sure, but I must say, in corporate Australia, a code of conduct within that corporation is actually, it's business as usual. And I think that's what people have found so amazing, that Parliament and politicians aren't held to any sort of standard of conduct. I think that's been a revelation that we've all found very, very difficult.
Yeah.
In the UK, is there a code of conduct for Parliament?
No, I think my understanding is that there's not a written code of conduct.
Oh.
There's sort of an understanding of what is appropriate and inappropriate behaviour. But I think it lacks the teeth about saying that people sign up to it and that there's clear sanctions there as well. So, yeah.
So it's a gentleman's understanding, isn't it?
Yes, and gentleman being the key word there.
Yes, of course. So you and your family are about to relocate in a very, very unusual time. How are you all feeling about that?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. We're very excited to be coming to Australia. So for me, it's a coming home. I actually grew up in Canberra and I did my undergraduate, my PhD at ANU. So coming back to ANU is not necessarily something I anticipated happening, but it's something that's very exciting. And I think there's something comforting about coming home during a sort of, when the world is on fire with this sort of pandemic. But it also raises a whole lot of just logistical issues. There's so much uncertainty just around, trying to buy and sell houses, trying to even book a flight and quarantine. We've got to quarantine for longer than our dogs need to quarantine coming back from Australia. And of course, we're happy to do that. We understand the importance of needing to quarantine, but just trying to work all of that out and to balance that. Even small things like selling a house. We can't just have an open house here where, 100 people come and see it and then it gets sold. We have to have individual people coming to see with social distancing and those sorts of things. So everything seems drawn out and a bit more complex and a bit more difficult. But I'm so excited about the job and about coming home, about being closer to my family and friends that I grew up with, that I guess all that uncertainty is worth it. Yeah.
Yeah, great. And we're very excited about you coming. And Michelle, last question. What books or podcasts have you recently enjoyed and would you like to recommend them and share them with us?
Yeah, I've just actually, I'm part of a book group here in the UK. It's made up of a range of people. So we've got some Germans and some Americans and some Australians and some Brits as well. And we just read The Yield by Tara June Winch, an Australian book, which I really adored and really enjoyed. But what I enjoyed most actually was discussing it with non-Australians as well. So I think myself and the other Australians in the group had a particular cultural context in which to understand that book, really listening to Americans and Germans and Brits talking about it and their views of it, and actually their surprise about a lot of the issues was very interesting. So I found that fascinating. I think partly I think growing up in 70s and 80s Australia, I think we didn't know very much about a lot of what happened in terms of the stolen generation and in terms of systemic sort of issues that were there. And I think that's still the same with a lot of people overseas. They don't understand those sorts of things. So that was a great discussion. In terms of podcasts, there's a couple that I really like. I listened to Julia Gillard's a podcast of One's Own, which I love. I mean, I love that Virginia Woolf reference, and I love the variety of people that she speaks to as well. So you might be, speaking to a very senior politician one day and then an author the next, and those sorts of things. But another podcast I like very much is two public intellectuals in the US, Roxane Gay and Tracy McMillan Cottom, and they've got an excellent podcast called Here to Slay. And I like that very much. One, because they're both so bright and so funny, but I love how the discussions range. So 1 minute you might be talking about intersectional feminism and the next minute you're talking about barbecues and popular culture. And so I love that sort of ranging sort of thing. And they just seem to enjoy it so much. There's so much joy. And I think there's something lovely about seeing two women sparking off each other and just having this discussion that I always feel very motivated and excited after listening to them.
Yeah, there is something really good about two women sparking off each other, aren't there? Like in Australia, Lee Sales and Annabelle Crabb have a podcast that they do, and also Fran Kelly and Patricia Carvelis.
Yes.
And I love listening to those. Michelle, such a treat being able to speak to you. Thank you so much for joining us, and we're looking forward to seeing you when you come back to Australia, back home.
Thanks so much, Carol. It's been an absolute pleasure.